There's a long history of transgender people in the military. We saw a lot of progress as a result of some of these shifts with policies where transgender people were able to serve openly. As more recently, as we're seeing that a lot of people are finding themselves in the position where they either are no longer eligible to join the military or they're being separated. So now, there's a lot of trauma, right, that are impacting transgender people. I think that part of this moves to the conversation of normalizing gender diversity. There's various ways that somebody can identify and express their gender, and that doesn't necessarily relate to somebody's eligibility or potential to serve their country.
Welcome to Just Healing, where we rediscover humanity in our conversations around trauma and celebrate all the unique ways we love and heal. Hi, and welcome everybody to this next episode of Just Healing. And today we have a very interesting topic from someone I have known, oh my God, now I'm going back at least 17 years, I think. I have known this person, and he is always amazing. And his name is Adam Yerke, and he is a psychologist, but I'm going to let him tell you his background himself. So Adam, introduce yourself to the audience.
All right. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Adam Yerke, and I'm a clinical and forensic psychologist. I live in Southern California. And, in the field of psychology, I've worked for a number of years in academia. And some of my areas of focus have included gender and sexuality, specifically transgender populations. And, I've been especially interested in how different topics with policy and legislation impact the population. So that's sort of been my area of scholarship and publications on various topics, victims of partner violence, obviously the militaries we're going to talk about today, transgender athletes, individuals who are incarcerated, and then I also work as doing evaluations as a forensic psychologist.
Well, awesome. You have a vast knowledge of expertise. So, we can just get into it. What have you done any research in this area?
Well, most of the work that I've done is, like I said, sort of analyzing legislation and policies that impact transgender people. So, when we've had, changes to funding available to victims of partner violence, for instance, how is that becoming available to transgender people? Obviously, as we're going to talk about today with like the military, how have the policies over the years, which, have changed, how have those impacted transgender people, and just knowing in general, about the population, what we know about people who have been serving openly and not so for many years. So really that's been an area of focus, and really, though, also just areas in terms of more general topics related to trans communities as well, just, like identity, and looking at differences across culturally and across generations, and how people's experiences of being trans are different by the time in history that they identify or transition, as well as the culture that they're from.
Yes, so that is very interesting that you said that, because I've been looking and talking to people because we have this history of, gays in the military, don't ask, don't tell, and then it was nobody cared, and now we're back. It's like we went backwards into something, but different cultures are responding differently to different things about this topic. And so I was wondering, what you think of it and what are the problems in society today?
Right. Yeah. So, there's a long history of transgender people in the military. And so even, long before that they were able to serve openly, we have individuals that have, served either maybe before they transitioned or they just had to remain in the closet. And so how I really got interested in this topic, transgender people in the military, was when Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed, and seeing that, well, this is definitely a step forward for people who identify as gay, lesbian, bisexual, but this doesn't impact transgender people, right? And so knowing that transgender people are still at a place where they don't have the opportunity to serve their country. And so from that point, I've really been following closely the changes in legislation and policies and also how the transgender communities have been impacted by that, right? So, just like with Don't Ask, Don't Tell, being able to serve openly, it definitely impacts, somebody's sense of self quite differently than when you have to keep, your identity secret. Maybe, individuals delaying transitioning or coming out as transgender because, their identity as being somebody in the military is more important to them at the time, or, it's hard to sometimes sort of self-select, what identity may be something that you have to prioritize. And I think that that's just really common among people in general, right? That we all have various identities. And so somebody having to choose to be transgender over being in the military obviously is very difficult. And then it also creates a lot of internalized transphobia, which we would really refer to as like discrimination against transgender people. So this sense of, shame, and then of course that can contribute to mental health problems. So we saw a lot of progress as a result of some of these shifts with policies where transgender people were able to serve openly in the military and really being seen as these are other people who are serving their countries, not, well, you can't do this because you're transgender, or, you can't even be in the military, or you're going to be discharged. So now, there's a lot of really, effects, I guess you could say, of trauma, right, that are impacting transgender people related to military service. Because in the last few years with, policies sort of like changing, you can stay in, you can't, so that's really unsettling, right? And, makes people feel sort of like anxious, hypervigilant. So just thinking about, not knowing what's going to happen in the next 6 months, in the next year. And so, more recently, as we're seeing that a lot of people are finding themselves in the position where they either are no longer eligible to join the military, or they're being separated, or they're signing, voluntary separation. So, this is really, just a really impactful time for people who have been in the military or interested in serving the military and who identify as transgender.
Yeah, it is a very unique time. And I was talking to somebody, and the real definition of ignorance is untaught, right? So I was just blown away, like because they didn't get it. They really thought being gay or lesbian was the same as being transgender.
Yeah.
And I said, people lump that together with the
Right.
LGBTQ
Right.
movement. I said, but they're completely different things, right? And then they went further to say, well, you're just telling me who you want to sleep with. And I said, yeah,
Yeah.
and that is a common
Yeah.
miss, right? But I
Right.
honestly, because I was emotionally reacting, didn't even know how to move this forward for a great
Hmm.
discussion, right? And how
Right.
respond? Like, how could you respond to
Yeah.
that? Like,
I mean, I think part of it is that we have this sort of like pathology that's been associated with trans people for so long, right? That these are like sexual deviants, right? That, yeah, that they're doing this because they're perverted, or because
yeah,
they're mentally ill, or, even as sometimes say, well, they're trying to pretend that there's something, to gain some sort of privileges, right? And so I think that, like you said, I mean, a lot of it is just really people not knowing, right? This misunderstanding. And then that's sort of like this message that is being now continually portrayed is that, well, see, transgender people, they are different, right? They're so different that they can't serve their countries, right? And that's even though we have research that actually shows that, they contribute very much to the military, and there really aren't any negative impacts to the military. And that includes like the morale, and cohesion of their units, their eligibility, even the fiscal implications. So, I think that part of this moves to the conversation of normalizing gender diversity and understanding that this is just part of being a person, right? The same way we have some people who are really feminine and some people who are really masculine, and that there's various ways that somebody can identify and express their gender, and that doesn't necessarily relate to somebody's eligibility or potential to serve their country.
right, right.
I think, again, I just have to go back to and highlight that we have research that says that there are not, negative impacts by including transgender people in the military. If anything, it's to the contrary, right? That just like other individuals, they contribute in very meaningful ways for our national security. And so, just to add, I think that that's also part of what makes it difficult for trans people at this point, because there is a sense of they've devoted so much, to their country and to serving their country, and now feeling that that maybe wasn't valued, right? So it's like you did all these things, and typically, we applaud and we honor, people who are military service members, but now we're sort of seeing that individuals are experiencing that actually, thanks but no thanks, right? Like we actually don't want you to serve, even though, we know there's many, many stories in the media of high ranking transgender, officers and military service members who, are leaders. And not only, I should, broaden it, that it's not just also them individually that's impacted, but it's then also the potential performance of the units that they're a part of, right? That they're a part of a team, and some of these individuals are leaders of that team. And so it's a whole disruption to that larger system. um and so, but again, like, we're putting people sort of in this position where we're portraying this message that transgender people are they're not as good as people who are cisgender or not transgender, right? That they do have some deviancy that precludes them. And that really, that goes back to more than a decade ago, in terms of we did have policies that changed, in the last 10 years, that did include transgender people. And so we're seeing sort of like, the pendulum swinging in both directions. But really what we're going back to is policies that really sort of focused on the pathology, which I would say also are really assumptions. My understanding of being really involved in, the research um, of trans people is the research just doesn't support that, right? It really shows more that, there's no reason that any population couldn't be eligible. And I think also, just to add, that this sort of description is really different than the same reasons that other populations were excluded, including gay, lesbian, and bisexual people, including women, Black individuals, right? So it's very similar, where you take sort of like a group of people and, exclude them. And again, then how does that affect that individual feeling not good enough, but then also how other people perceive that population? So the ripple effects, they really do, extend throughout society.
So do you think it's more global or is it microstemic to us in the US? Like, it seems like you said,
Right.
ripple. Which one is it, do you think?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I would say it's definitely both. I mean, like I said, I think it can definitely start at the individual level, but then even more from, and then, like I said, sort of the broader military, the units and that sort of thing. But then also looking at these individuals, and, many of them have partners, they have families. Um, and so they're also being impacted as well, because part of this is showing that they're not going to have the same retirement benefits.
No.
They've dedicated maybe their careers to being in the military service, and now they have to start all over, right? I mean, I think we can imagine when we're in a career and we've been doing that for years, and then it's just the end. It's like, wow, where do you begin? So there's even like sort of like the financial and just logistical things. But I do think that obviously a lot of people look to the US for, leadership on different things. But there's actually, before the US, there have been several different militaries, armed forces that around the world that have included transgender people. The last I checked, I think it was at least 20. So, just knowing that other countries have been doing this for a very long time. And that's also part of what informed some of our research that shows that there really aren't negative impacts to the military. So I do think that, the US, it, people, again, they look to the US in terms of being a leader, especially, around the military, service. And so I think that it shows that as the US, that actually, our sort of view on transgender people is that they're not good enough to be in the military, right? Like, there is all this sort of pathology with them that precludes them from being able to serve. So I do think that it does impact worldwide in terms of that message that's portrayed about transgender people.
Yeah, I definitely think so. And it sends a message that, like you said, they're not good enough, or I'm not a full person, or like all of these negative messages, and what are we teaching our children? What are we teaching our other generations with that? And you're not even good enough for your pension, yet you've served your country. Like it's mind boggling to me, you know? And how do we repair that? Like, what do you think?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it is is difficult to think about that, right? Because, sometimes these types of dilemmas take years and years to solve, right? And it took a really long time to get to the point of even considering inclusion of transgender people in the military. So, I think part of this begins with just the everyday conversations that we have about normalizing gender differences, right? That and normalizing that transgender people, they share a lot more similarities to the general population than not, right? So we're certainly all much more similar than we are different. So I think just, thinking about the ways that we can have these conversations in our daily lives that destigmatize transgender people. It's all transgender people should be included or excluded from the military in the same way all non-transgender or cisgender people, right? We're just not all, prepared to serve, in the military. So, but I think the idea is not making these assumptions and not putting forward these assumptions that, first of all transgender people are the same, right? Because it's an incredibly diverse community, but also that being transgender is not inherently, it doesn't mean things that relate to a person's mental health. Let me start that again. I think that, the idea is we just want to make sure that, people recognize that there's nothing inherently mentally or physically wrong with transgender people. And by portraying those types of messages, it then reinforces that, well, that type of internalized discrimination that then creates more mental health issues and makes more barriers in place for transgender people. So anything we can do in just our everyday conversations, but then of course, people who have, more ability to provide services and support to transgender people, that of course is necessary. And I think, important aspect of that too is honoring the identity that's associated with the military because, sometimes, when people are sort of part of different communities, they tend to sort of like, feel pressure to kind of suppress one, over the other. Like, well, I'm part of this religious community, but I'm also gay. And it's like, well, how do I sort of, manage both of those, knowing that perhaps there's, some differences in beliefs between the two different communities. So honoring that aspect of their identity as well as being transgender, I think is important, right? We don't want to necessarily sort of write off their military service or say it wasn't important because it was, right? So it's very selfless to be able to put yourself in a position where, helping to serve the national security of our country. So I do think, part of it is those everyday conversations. And it's also our individual work too, right? So we all receive similar messages. And so we all, have the potential to stigmatize, discriminate against other people. And so we also want to continue to challenge ourselves about how we can see things more objectively.
So you're talking about doing things objectively, but I live with my 81-year-old mother, 82
Right.
soon, right? And I don't know how I can explain these
Right.
things to her, right? And
Right.
yet when I talk to someone who's maybe like 60 or 50, or you talk to a young person, they completely understand it, right? And because of different messages and different things.
Hmm.
But now I don't know. Are we going backwards? Are we going
Hmm.
back to the mindset of my mother who's in her generation,
Right.
you
Right.
know?
Right. Yeah, I think that we really want to try to sort of focus on like the sort of humanistic aspect of it. And I think like, as a psychologist, sort of trying to help people have empathy for other people, right?
Right.
And again, sort of recognizing that we are all so much more similar than we are different, right? I mean, yes, we look different, we have different ethnicities, people are from different, places, and also with gender, right? And that's something that, transgender people have always existed. And so I think that part of, people might think, well, this is a trend or people are being pushed into this. but really recognizing that this is a normal, part of the ways that, humans express themselves, right? And so this is something that, we've understood for many years.
Well, and you also talked about, people expressing themselves for many years and things like that. And, how do we explain this to someone who's really small, like a younger child?
Mhm.
Like how,
Right.
because they're watching it, they're
Mhm.
watching us,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
So how would you explain this to
Mhm.
maybe your 8 year
Mhm.
old, you know?
Right. And I think sometimes, stories are really helpful, right? Because that's, when we're trying to build empathy and understand other people, there's been a lot of really great stories that I've seen in the media about transgender people in the military, or who have been separated from the military, or who are trying to figure out how they're going to proceed with their lives. So reading those stories, listening to those stories, watching those stories, it really helps us understand that, wow, this is a real person. They don't seem that different from me. They have a family. They seem, wow, they're a leader in the military. They've been serving for 10 years. And so I think that, again, then it sort of like starts to break down those stereotypes. And so, whether that's somebody older, or younger, that we can show similar things to people who are younger, but there are also, these days, there are so many great books to introduce kids to various topics, about diversity. And so that includes gender identity. There's, many books that are very helpful. And I think it just helps us understand, like, well, how did you know that you were a woman? Or how did you know that you were a girl? How did you know? Because there is something very inherent in that. Or even, how do you know what you like to wear? How do you know, like, how you want to wear your hair? So I think when we go back to, like, well, what are our sort of like natural tendencies, and helping people get in touch with their own authenticity, then we're in a position to better support other people in their authenticity as well.
Right. And it's like letting people have those thoughts, right? Like you're saying, how did you know? And it's like, I know because I am, right? And people don't realize sometimes it's that simple for people, especially people who are transgender. They know because they are. And it's nothing, not a flaw. It's not, they know because they are, right? I always tell the story about my son, because I let him decide what he wants to do, what he wants to do,
Hmm.
right? And I and I would always say to him, like when we played the game of life, he could pick a boy or a girl. I didn't care who we picked to be married to or whatever.
Hmm.
And so finally we're standing in a store, and I said, like, oh well, when whoever they are, when you're married, he
Hmm.
goes, Mama, I am asserting my gender preference right now. I like girls. It's okay to say that now. I'm like,
Hmm.
okay, when did that happen?
Hmm. Right. Yeah. Right.
But if you teach your kids that it doesn't
Hmm.
matter,
Right.
it's
Yeah.
not gonna be a weird? So
And I think we see so much more openness and acceptance to younger generations. I mean, obviously, there's still a lot of variation depending on the types of influences that people have, where they live or their families, because I think that that does play a role, right? So it's like people's parents, their families, and their communities. How do they learn about these things? But yeah, and my own kids as well. I see a lot of openness, and I also see that there are certain things that still stick, right? In terms of
mhm.
my son not wanting to wear pink, not because he doesn't like it, but because other people,
Told him. Yes. It was.
by looking at the younger generations, my kids and my nieces and nephews, and seeing the way that they have sort of just embraced and moved forward. Somebody says these are their gender pronouns, they then maybe they meet somebody else and it's different. It's just they accept it more, that this is sort of just a natural part of being a member of a community, that there are differences between us, right? But those differences don't make us less than, or you know mentally ill or, bad or in any way.
Shouldn't even be in the DSM. It really shouldn't. And like when they dropped gay from the DSM, at first, I was like, well, when are they going to drop transgendered? Because gender dysphoria, there's no dysphoria. You are because you are. You know that, right? There's nothing. There's not a flaw there, and people don't really get that. And I watched famous comedian. I adore him, and I can't say it because I don't want to have to pay him,
Hmm.
but he did this whole thing, and he went off on this one, I think, senator, because this senator was like so against drag queens reading books to little children.
Right.
And he's like,
Yeah.
okay, but you're okay with guns, you're okay with this, all these things kill people. What is the problem with a story read by somebody, a person, a human? And I was just like, if we thought more like that, right? And I know that the two aren't the same, drag
Right.
queens
Yeah.
and
Right.
in that
Yeah.
are not the same. But if we thought more like that of the exposure and realizing a story is just a story, he's just reading to the little kids can
Yeah.
figure it out on their own. Let them
Right.
live life on their own. You
Yeah.
don't
And
need
so I think sometimes
to.
people think there's the fear that, like,
Yeah,
oh, well, if I talk about these things, if I read this book, well, then they're gonna want to start calling themselves a boy, right, or a girl, right? And again, like, that's just not true. We
silly.
don't have any indication to support that. In fact, we have research to show the opposite. That we've had for decades at this point that show that there's no differences in the way children identify their gender or their sexual orientation based on who their parents are, right? So if they grow up with, like, two mommies, right, they actually turn out to be very well adjusted just as much, as anybody else. It doesn't create differences. So I think, again, there's sort of this fear that, like we were talking about earlier, comes from, these misconceptions and, ignorance. So that's where our everyday conversations with people, trying to challenge those stigmas and present evidence, right? Of course, as somebody who, is in, academia and, research, these topics, I just always go back to, this is what the research tells us, right? Yeah, you may have met somebody, or maybe the talk of, your kid's school, but what do we know about thousands upon thousands of people, right? So those types of, you know, studies really give us a more accurate perception. And that's where, again, going back to the military, that we have the research that shows that people are just as successful in the military when they identify as transgender as they don't.
Right. And, my husband had two moms and he's fine. Right. But, you taught me something one time we were at the Chicago school. I would never forget this conversation because we're so subtle. I don't even know if it even registered to you. Okay. And so it was when that we had moved to the new building and we had the gender bathrooms where male and female were in
Mm,
there. Right. And I was having such a hard time adjusting to it. And it's not my norm. And you're like, I'm really surprised that you're having a hard time adjusting. I'm like, I don't know why. I said, you know what it is? And I could articulate it once you started talking to me. I wanted female things, and having a guy come out be in the bathroom when I'm doing girly things,
mm,
it makes me uncomfortable. He goes, "What do you do in your family?" And you just said, "What
mm,
do you do in your
mm,
family?" And I
mm,
went, "Well, I just go do what I got to do." He goes, "So
mm,
what's different?
mm.
You're
Right.
putting it on it not being normal for you, but it's completely normal for you to do whatever you do in the bathroom at your house.
Mm,
Why
yeah.
are you doing that?" And I went, "Oh, damn." Like, I mean, it just completely hit me
Yeah.
like I was doing that.
Hmm.
Nobody else was doing that,
Right.
right? And if
Right.
people thought more about that, thought about it in that way, right? And what's your stuff and what are you putting in it and what is really normal, what's not, like you'll stop doing all
Hmm.
that stuff
Right.
and because you're adding your own spin to something that most people just aren't even thinking that deeply about. People are
And I
people.
think, we get used to certain things, right?
Yeah.
So for so long we've been doing, gender segregated bathrooms.
Yeah.
But there's many other places in the world where that doesn't exist, right? They don't segregate by gender. So, in the same way, there's cultures that they support and honor people who are
Right.
trans people.
Right.
So we get really sort of like rooted in the cultural context and think that that's the only way, but it's not. If we look cross culturally and, across time, that there's many examples where working with and living with transgender people is altogether quite different, and really more of a respected and honored population that is seen as essential to
Oh,
some populations.
absolutely. There's different cultures where it is considered a blessing. So, yeah, I've seen that too, and it's just we put our stuff in there. Well, Adam, what do you wanna leave people with? Because this has been a very interesting conversation, especially for
Yeah.
me.
Yeah, I think I just mostly want to leave people with just the idea that, recognizing, as I had mentioned earlier, that, whether someone is transgender or cisgender, non-transgender, that we really share so many more similarities than differences. And so we tend to focus on those differences rather than looking at our shared similarities. And so, recognizing that we're not altogether that different. And so the way that relates to people in the military, that similarly, right, the transgender people are not altogether that different from other service members. And they also want to serve their countries. They also are interested in safeguarding national security. And, I'm certainly very grateful to them and their service that they provided, especially when it has not always been, a welcoming place for them. Um, and so just, thinking again about how we can continue to challenge those stereotypes and push the conversation forward that, shows that, yeah, these individuals are just as capable. Um, we really want to honor, what they've done to serve our country.
Yeah, it comes down to what's the goal and why does
Hmm.
this matter? Why does gender
Right.
matter?
Right. Yeah, because we need people in the military, right? And
Exactly.
so, yeah, so I mean, it's, we think about there's tens of thousands of people who identify as transgender and who are in the military. So without those individuals, like I said, there's going to be disruption, and it is a loss because it's not just, well, no longer can trans people serve in the military, too bad. It's like, wow, you're taking up a really large group of people that are contributing. So it's a loss. I think it's a loss for those individuals, but it's a loss for their families, their communities, their units, the larger military, and then just also in general the way that we consider transgender people in the US.
So how do people get a hold of you?
Well, they can always email me at Adam F period Yerke Yerke at gmail.com.
All right. Well, thank you, Adam, for being on this episode of Just Healing. And thank you, everybody, for listening.
Thanks so much for having me.